I'm going to kill these once again. We're on, I know I say this like every week, but we're like almost there with our sound system. Closer than we were last week at getting everything squared up. And thanks to the hard work of AJ and some of the guys that he's had down here helping him, we are getting closer every week to that. So anyways, yeah, how's everybody doing? Everybody have a good week? Yeah, it's been a good week, man. Thank you guys so much for being here. Glad to have everybody back. We had some people traveling the last few weeks, and glad we got some folks back in town. I'm going to quickly sort of launch into things this morning, because as you know, I have a tendency to sort of go long, and I need to do a recap. I'm going to do something that I don't typically do, and that's I'm going to spend a few minutes sort of recapping where we were last week, partially because we had a few people out, and but mostly because it is like integrally important to where we're going this morning. We are in our Waypoint series. This is where we're going to work through all 111 verses of the Sermon on the Mount. And we started that off last week, really kicked it off strong with our Beatitudes, which are those 8 statements about our attitude that Jesus begins his most famous, his longest sermon, the Sermon on the Mount with. And we said the attitude is important. Of the things that affect your life, attitude sets roughly at 100% of that, right? And if you don't believe me, then go read the book of Job, right? And check his attitude out, and check what the right attitude can mean, even in the worst of circumstances, right? It is no coincidence then that this is how Jesus begins his most famous teaching, is on our attitude, because everything that follows after this is going to flow from these attitudes, right? And so we really have to take our time. So I want to go back because I think these attitudes are important enough for us to hit again. Even if you remember everything I said last week, chances are you probably don't, though, right? And so I think it's important that we kind of work our way back through that, all right? So again, something that I don't do often, but we're going to do this morning. You guys ready? It's going to be a wild ride for about the next 12 minutes, I think, all right? So here we go. I'm going to cover, we went through 7 of the 8 Beatitudes last week, and we left this last Beatitude, and we said that it really has to have its own week, just because of how foreign it is to us, right? So all of these Beatitudes begin with this blessed are statement, right? Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, right? And so this blessed are statement is connected to our joy, right? Blessed are simply means to take joy in, and it's this commitment to a reality beyond the circumstances, right? That happiness is directly tied to our circumstances. If you don't believe me, I could make every one of you unhappy right now, right? I could do something or say something that would suck your happiness away in an instant. But joy, like, it goes beyond this. Joy is this commitment to a reality that lies beyond us, right? Like it produces a happiness that can't be taken away in those instances, right? That's joy. So every one of these is blessed are, and then there's this premise that if you would do this thing or you would have this attitude, then you would experience the promise that is attached to the end of it. So blessed are, there's a premise, and then there's a promise, right? And we get to take joy in these attitudes because, like, we get to lay a hold of these promises now, that these aren't just some future reality, like off in the distance, right? Like inheriting the kingdom of heaven. It sounds like something very otherworldly and like we're going to experience on the other side of death, right? But I showed you at every turn how actually all of these things have a component to them that are meant to be grasped and lived out in the here in the now, that actually provide joy and comfort in the blessed life, as it were, right? And so here we go. We're going to work through all 7 of the Beatitudes that we did last week. And if you're here last week, you're probably thinking, like, no way we're going to do this in 12 minutes, right? But let me start my timer, actually. So here we go. Matthew 5:3. This was our first one. If you're taking notes, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. I said that poor in spirit means that we bring nothing to the equation in our relationship with God. This is banking terms, right? This is a realization that we come before God and we have nothing but debt to bring. Now, please do not answer this question, but did anyone in here marry someone that had a significant debt, right? Again, do not answer that question, right? But chances are, maybe you knew about the debt before you got married, or maybe it was like, hey, surprise, I got $40,000 of debt, right? After you're married. Chances are, though, even if you knew about that debt, you probably didn't marry that person for their debt, right? Like, they probably brought something beyond just their debt into that relationship that would cause you to, marry that person. But between us and God, that wasn't the case, right? That we actually didn't bring anything but debt into that relationship, that we were at war, we were separated and far away from God. And it's this realization that we didn't bring anything into our relationship that actually is the thing that begins our relationship with God in the first place, right? Now, when we realize this and we see this like in its proper context, then we begin to see God's grace and His mercy and His forgiveness in their proper context, right? And when we live this out, we look to God as the sole provider for our salvation and not our own efforts, right? We're quick to lean on His understanding, His grace, and His mercy in all situations. That's sort of the outworking of this, right? Because the kingdom of God is where God's rule and His reign are affected perfectly. It's not a place with borders, right? It's not in just some heavenly throne room somewhere, but it's in the here and now. When God reigns and rules in the hearts of people, like that is where the kingdom of heaven actually touches earth and people that are submitted to and following after God. All right, that's pretty quick, right? Second one, Matthew 5:4. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. To mourn means that we realize that our sin was costly. So it said that this was. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of my notes here. So this is not a perpetual state of mourning, right, where we live in this constant state of guilt and shame over the things that we've done. Now, maybe we've done things or said things or acted in ways that have come to light in our past that would cause us to feel guilty or feel shame or embarrassment, right? But this isn't a perpetual state of mourning, because the promise attached to this is that there's comfort to be found when we mourn, right? And it's sort of this like upside down equation. So how does that work? Well, a lot of us may like have this image of God that He's like the righteous white-haired deity in the sky with a lightning bolt in one hand, ready to just like strike you down for every little thing that you do, right? This verse, I believe, invites us to a different response to God. And that is that God has already struck someone down, and He struck them down on your behalf. And so we realize that our sin absolutely was costly, that it cost Jesus a gruesome and terrible death on a cross. But the good news, and the part that we get to take comfort in, is the fact that His last words on that cross is that it is finished. That those sins, if you have turned away and you've like sought to follow after God, right, in repentance, that those things are remembered no more, that they are separated as far as the east is from the west, right? And God doesn't hold those things over you. Like He doesn't hold those things that you should feel guilt and shame as you live out your life over those things. That it's finished. It's been dealt with. Our sin was costly. And as we realize this, it should make us quick to turn and seek forgiveness and restoration, right? And to not feel and to live and to walk in that constant state of mourning, guilt, and shame, right? Matthew 5:5. Blessed are the gentle, for they shall inherit the earth. We said that gentle isn't the word that was originally used there. We said there was another word. Anybody remember what that word was? Meek. Yeah, meek. And I said I don't really like that word because it sort of conjures the image of this like mousy, quiet, like, I don't know, afraid of everything, afraid of their own shadow individual. And I'm super thankful that that's not what Jesus meant by this, right? Meekness isn't weakness, but it actually refers to power under control and is ultimately about submission. This meekness is actually a farming term. It's used to refer to the domestication of wild animals. And I don't mean like turning a cat or a dog into a pet. I mean taking like an ox or a cow or something like that on its own, that its life is fairly purposeless. It's going to walk around and it's going to eat grass, right? And if it gets into the wrong pasture, or if it gets around people, it's going to make a royal mess of things, right? But through the domestication, teaching this animal to respond to and to submit to the hand of the farmer, that now this like animal has a purpose, right? This animal can pull a cart. It can plow a field. It can do some amazing things. And I said likewise that as we learn to submit to God and His leading, right, that God has this amazing plan and a purpose for your life, and we have this great potential, right, that if we choose to submit and to follow His design for our life and like the path that He has sort of laid out for us, right, that like the end result of that is that we inherit the earth. How in the world do you inherit the earth, right? That one's kind of weird, right? That is to say that as we learn to lean into and submit to God and His leading, that God will give you the deepest desires of your heart. Now, that isn't like some prosperity gospel pitch that if you just believe the right things or have enough faith that you can have, wealth or good health or whatever it is. That's not what that means. It's this idea that the prayers that most often get answered are the ones that started in heaven. Right? If you want to see God answer yes to something, like if you want to see him answer yes to something this week, then pray something that God is already praying to see done in you and through you and in the world around you. And the answer will always be yes in those instances. When we pray the things that God is already wanting to see done in us and through us and in the world around us, the answer is always yes. But the only way that we know how to pray that is if we live in this constant state of submission. You guys hanging with me? I know we're having to do some work here. We're going back through things. Everybody doing good? Head nods? All right. I don't want to put you to sleep like first thing. I promise it's going to way liven up as we go into this, all right? Matthew 5:6. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Hunger and thirst, this is ultimately about satisfaction. I said that we all have cravings that fit into one of three categories, right? Cravings for success, cravings for significance, and cravings for satisfaction. Right? Like that everything that we want in life, it's going to fit into one of those categories, right? Nobody approaches life wanting to be a failure, right? Wanting to be a failure in their marriage or be a failure in their finances or at their business or at their job. Whatever the case is, like nobody, I said last week, there's no idealistic 17-year-old that's looking at colleges like hoping to be homeless someday, right? Like, oh, I think this will set me up to like live on the streets, you know? No, nobody wants that. Nobody is reaching for insignificance. Nobody's reaching for dissatisfaction, that those things run counter to who we are as human beings. I said the problem, though, is that when we go and we shortcut our way to those satisfactions, right? That God has put these guardrails around our life, and he's been incredibly explicit about those things. And he's marked out the boundaries of good and evil, and there's all of this freedom that we have in the middle ground. It's as we pursue life as he intended it for that we actually experience the greatest amount of satisfaction. I said it was like this. If you're a parent and you have little kids, then you probably lock up the cleaning cabinet, right? Why is that? Is it because you just, like, they would have way too much fun with the bleach, right? No, that's not why we would do that, right? It's because we filled this house, like, with this, like, all kinds of toys and good food and comfortable, like, clothing and bedding, like, a life, like, full of satisfaction. And we know that behind that door only lies heartache and pain and death at the end of the road. And so we put this thing off boundaries, not because we're holding out on our children, but because we actually want to increase their satisfaction in life, right? And it works the same way with God, that when we operate within these guardrails, that's actually when we have the fullest human experience, the greatest joy, the greatest satisfaction, success, and significance is found within those guardrails. Now, at this point last week, we shifted. You guys still with me? You're still doing good. I promise this is the driest part, and then it's going to liven up, right? We shifted because if we're not careful, we can kind of see all of these Beatitudes as like these singular attitudes that we're to have, right? Like we kind of get to pick and choose, and it's like, yeah, you know what? I actually do pretty good at the whole poorness of spirit, and I do really good at the mourning over my sin, right? Nobody beats me up worse than I do over that, and so maybe I think I do okay at that, but, you know, I realize I might need some work in the whole submission piece, that it doesn't work like that. Actually, all of these Beatitudes are contingent on one another. That if we fail to come to God in a poorness of spirit, then what does that say about what we think about our sin, right? That we can be the remedy to that it elevates self, and we can fix what's wrong with us and what's wrong with the world, instead of seeing God as the only one who has the power to actually affect that change in us and in the world around us, right? That's and then out of that, like if that's our attitude, what does that say about our submission? Are we going to be likely to submit to God and his leading, his design, or are we going to continue down that path and to kind of reach for satisfaction, success, and significance on our own terms, right? See, all of these are actually really contingent on one another, and the first four are different than the second four. I don't know if you knew this or not, but much like the Ten Commandments, there's a section of these, the first half of the Beatitudes, have to do with these inward attitudes that we have between us and the Father, this vertical relationship. Now, the second four Beatitudes are these external attitudes, and you're gonna see that as we go into this, like these external attitudes that affect our relationship with our fellow man. And because these are contingent, right, like because all of these like rely on one another, like we can't have some piece that is missing and then expect everything that follows after that to not be messed up, right? That's sort of how this thing works, right? So we shifted, and these next four are about our relation, these external attitudes and our relationship with our fellow man. So Matthew 5:7, blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Merciful has everything to do with our compassion towards other people. There's a difference between mercy and grace, right? Grace is not giving someone, or is giving someone something that they don't deserve, right? That's grace. And if you got kids and you've been through the Christmas holiday, you know good and well some of those little guys deserve coal in their stocking, right? But you don't do that, right, do you? Like you love them. They're a mess, but they're your little mess. And you're going to extend grace to them and mercy regularly because you love them with all of your heart, right? Mercy is that thing you pray for when you've been pulled over for doing 20 over in a school zone, right? Please do not give me that ticket that I absolutely deserve in this moment, right? We said that if you fail to show mercy, that if you fail to show the grace and you fail to show forgiveness to other people, then you've actually missed something very critical to your relationship with God. Jesus tells this story about this servant. Comes before the king, and the king forgives him what is the equivalent of millions of dollars of this debt that he owes, right? And what does he do? Does he go out and does he immediately forgive the debts that people owed him? No. Like, the echo hadn't even left the room yet, and he finds another servant that owed him the equivalent of some pocket change, and he begins to beat him in the street and throw him in prison. And Jesus says, you've missed it. You've missed what you've actually been forgiven, the grace and the mercy that's been extended to you, because if you had actually got that, you would extend that same grace and that same mercy and same forgiveness, right? So, Jesus can effectively say here, blessed are the merciful because they shall receive mercy. Because if you don't and you aren't merciful, then you've missed it. And you don't have the mercy and the grace and the forgiveness of God. That you're still walking in the opposite of those things. You're still at war with God. You haven't understood what it means to actually live that out. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Pure in heart is about our motives. And this is actually kind of a tricky one. Because it seems like one of those like vertical relationship pieces, those inward attitudes. But this actually, in its proper context, is about our relationship and our motives with other people. That is, do we see people as a means to an end, right? As something that we can use to garner success or garner position or authority, or like, are people just a means to our ends to sort of build our kingdom? Or do we see people as what God sees them as His image, right? Like that He created every man, every woman, and every child in His image. And that changes how we approach them, right? So what are our motivations towards people? Well, if you're living the blessed life, right? If these attitudes exist in you and you are experiencing the promises that are found in these things, that is amazing, right? That's comfort. That is compassion. That is walking in grace and mercy. That is walking in ultimate satisfaction, right? That is the good, blessed, joy-filled life. And if that's what we're experiencing, how can we not share that with other people, right? Like that becomes all of a sudden our motivation in every relationship that we have, is that, man, we want people to experience the goodness and the joy and the blessed life that we are experiencing. So we can't help but tell people about this, right? And so the promise is that if we do this, we shall see God. And again, I don't actually think that that's something far off in the distant future. I talked about this illustration that I wanted to do. I actually wanted to bring a giant mirror up here and smash it on stage. I decided against it, right? We got a bunch of littles that run around here. Probably not a good idea. But what's on the back side of a mirror, if you've ever seen it, right? It's like silver, this silver color. And so as we begin to teach people this, as we begin to carry out the Great Commission, which is teaching people to obey all the things that Jesus has commanded us, those things that connect us with this blessed, good, satisfied, joy-filled life, right? That what happens is we begin to sort of turn those pieces over, and it begins to reflect something. Why does God tell us that we're not allowed to make images of Him? Well, it's because He's already made images of Himself. He's made it in you and in me, people that are submitted to and walking in an importance of spirit, in a meekness of submission to Him, right? Like He's already made images of people. And so as we begin to turn people over, what do we see? We see God lived out in the world around us. And as we live this out, people begin to see God visibly through us. And what happens when all of our relationships, as we begin to turn all of these pieces over and sort of bring them back together as one piece, like we see a much fuller, more complete image of God as we live in community with one another. That's how we see God in the here and now. And then finally, we finished out last week with Matthew chapter 5, verse 9. It says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Peacemaking has everything to do with our attitude towards conflict. So there's two different types of people. There are peacekeepers and there are peacemakers, right? They both experience peace to some degree, One is a false peace that is easily broken, and when it is broken, it really makes a mess of things, and it destroys relationships and families and communities and governments and all kinds of things, right? So a peacekeeper, driving down the road of life, right, they come to the spot in the road where a tree has fallen across the road. And a peacekeeper will do anything they can to minimize the impact of that tree on their journey across, right? They'll put it in four-wheel drive, and they'll drive around the tree, or they'll like sort of slowly bump up over a tree to minimize the effects of conflict in their life. A peacemaker, on the other hand, as they come down that same road, and they come to that same thing, they get out. They get out in the pouring rain, in the sleet, and the snow. They take out their axe, and they cut that tree in half, and they move it to the sides of the road, because they know that they may have to travel this road again. And in fact, even if they don't, there's going to be other people that are going to travel this same road. That's what it means to be a peacekeeper, that we actually engage in the places of conflict in our lives, and in those lives around us that we have some relational capital in, right? That we're able to affect change and step into. That's what being a peacekeeper or a peacemaker actually means. And we said, this is the promise that we ended on last week, right? That the peacemakers are going to be called sons of God. And why is that? It's because Jesus, the Son of God, came, and his entire mission was a peacemaking mission. That he came and he laid his life down in a gruesome sacrificial act to restore peace between us and God. And he calls us to the same thing, that if we are truly God's sons and we are truly following after him, that our lives are going to mimic this same peacemaking mission. Right? That we go into the world and we make peace and we help people connect back to the life, the joy, the goodness that is found in a relationship with the Father, right? So that's where we ended things. Are you guys good? All right, we're good. Took a little longer, 12 minutes. That's longer I practiced. All right, but anyways, here we go. That's it, and I promise I didn't do that for nothing. We'll come back to it, and that's going to really matter a lot as we go into things. In the military, we do a lot of training. That is like an understatement of the year, probably. We train to train, and then we train more to like go on deployments, and then we come back from deployments and we have post-deployment training. Anybody done any of that, right? Like you're in this like constant perpetual state of training, and some of it is like awesome, super fun, doing really cool stuff. Most of it, though, I would say 95% of it is sitting in front of a computer, and it's terrible, right? And if you've been there, then you know exactly what I'm saying, right? Now, probably the funnest and yet most useless training I ever got in the military was SEER training. And if you've been through that, maybe you have mixed emotions about it, but for those of you who don't know what SEER training is, let me sort of explain that to you. SEER stands for Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape, right? With the idea being teaching you how to survive behind enemy lines. Should you find yourself captured or stranded alone in the wilderness in some hostile country, right? So how do you survive? So a lot of like out in the woods, Bear Grylls type stuff, building fires, like cleaning rabbits and chickens and stuff, and doing some really neat stuff, right? How do you survive on the ocean on a raft, right? Like anyways, really cool stuff. And there's 4 different levels of this training that you can go through. Level 1 is for people, or is like the computer-based simulation, right? And most of us probably pretty familiar with that. We got to do it every year or two. And you sit behind a computer for like 8 straight hours, and you go through this like simulation, and you get to make the choices, right? Sergeant Snuffy was shot in the leg. The forest is on fire, and you have malaria. What do you go after first, right? And you got to like sort of make the choices about what you're going to go after and how you're going to, and you make the wrong choices, and you wind up captured or dead or whatever. Anyways, so that's like the computer-based training. That's what just about everybody goes through. That's level 1. And on the far end of the other end of the spectrum is that level 4 training that is like 2.5, 3 months in the wilderness. And they like teach you these skills, and then they strand you out there. And they like teach you how to like catch your own food and how to like survive on a raft. And they like legit strand you on a raft in the ocean. And then they come and they capture you. And they bring you in and they like interrogate you and torture you to some degree, right? Like they like, it's very, very real. And so that's the other end of that spectrum. Now, here's the deal. The level of training that you get is completely dependent on your likelihood of finding yourself in that situation, right? So if you're a chef in the Air Force, right? Chef in the Air Force, right? Not a bad profession, but chances that you're going to find yourself in that. Level 1, level 4. Level 1, right? I got a level 0, right? Yeah, probably more. But they want you to have like some cursory knowledge about these things, so you're not completely helpless, right? Now, say you're special forces, and the majority of your job is done behind enemy lines, like already stranded. Like that's how you start your day, right? Are you going to need these things? Absolutely, right? So you're going to that level 4, and they're going to train you well in this. Now, here's why I bring all of this up, right? Our topic today is about how we operate behind enemy lines. Right? It's this realization that we live as aliens, as foreigners in a land that is not our own. And the occupying force of this land is actually not very friendly to us being here, right? And so there are all these passages throughout the New Testament, throughout the Bible, in fact, like the entire Bible talks about this. It's about how do God's people live in faithfulness in exile. And this really matters a lot, but the problem is I'm convinced that a lot of us view ourselves as the chef in this, right? It's like, we're never going to experience this. This isn't consistent with my experience of faith, right? I don't experience persecution. I don't experience these sorts of things, right? And so, like, why do I need this? And so what we'll do is we'll kind of click through the CBT, right? It's like, all right, let's get to other passages that actually have a lot to do with my life. I'm convinced that this is like the culmination of Jesus' Beatitudes, and we can't afford to do that. We got to spend some time, and we have to see ourselves in that sort of special forces role in this instance, right? Like that we absolutely need these words to prepare us for a reality that is here, should be here. I don't know. Anyway, so we're going to talk about what is hands down the most difficult topic to preach on in America, in the American church, and that is persecution, right? And so, without further ado, here is our 8th Beatitude, Matthew chapter 5, verse 10 through 12. Blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you. Anybody have a different word besides insult right there in their Bible? Anybody like tracking on that? Revile. Actually like that. That's closer to the original. Revile actually means to break out your teeth. That is like the most vivid detail of that word that we can get. It is a violent act where they break out your teeth, either with their words or with their fists, right? So blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Joyful, right? That's good stuff. So what in the world is going on here, right? I think that it is because the concept of persecution is so incredibly foreign to most of our experiences that's why this beatitude is getting its own week. I want us to dive into this concept a little bit, right? Now, I didn't use that seer example. I didn't use that to push a militaristic image of our faith. That's not why I use that at all. But instead, I want us to see that we're called to operate as those special forces, right? That we need more than the CBT as we approach this. We need more than that little computer-based training that we oftentimes take these passages as. Because we oftentimes kind of skim over these and we'll opt for things like, man, we can talk about poorness of spirit. We can talk about submission. And we may not like these things, but we can talk about these things. Those are easy. But persecution, what in the world? We don't actually really experience that. And I think that brings up a really good line of questions that I want us to dive into. And so today I want us to pursue this topic through sort of a line of logical questions where we pick up where each question ends. Are you guys tracking what I kind of mean on that, right? And I'll just give you the first one, and this is how we're going to start things. Why do we need this if we have never been in or never will be in a situation where this is actually relevant to us, right? And I think the short and sort of probably really unsatisfying answer is because Jesus actually talks a lot about this in the New Testament, right? And if we're just really honest, that is kind of an unsatisfying answer to this. Well, because Jesus said so. I really don't like to give that answer as the answer. So we're going to reach for something a little bit more, right? And so as we think about this question, I think another couple of questions come up, right? So outside of a few isolated incidents, and there are some incidents of genuine persecution that happen here in the United States, right? And we instantly sort of latch onto these, and like we go to court over them, or we rally the troops, and it's this like really big thing for us when we actually do see this. And so there are some isolated instances. I don't want to make it out like there never is, but for the most part, why are we not facing persecution here in the United States? That this is something that if we just sat down and had a conversation, that this is something that's inconsistent with most of our experiences. Have you ever thought about that? I mean, this isn't like Iran or China or Somalia, right? So maybe it is that Jesus just meant these words for people that lived in places like that, right? Like maybe he just meant this for people who lived in those kind of places. And I see Mike, who's been to those sorts of places, shaking his head no. And I think you're right, Mike. I think that the answer to that is no, that he meant that for all of us, actually. And we're gonna get into that. Maybe it's this. Is it because we have such favor with the world around us that it could hardly be said that we're in enemy territory, right? Dude, this is America, right? This is like land of the free, home of the brave, one nation under God, right? Like we're a Christian nation. And so like it's no like, of course we're not experiencing persecution, right? Because we are a Christian nation, right? Anybody? Well, not so fast, right? So usually the statistics that we pull that from are, they do a lot of Pew research and polls and stuff around faith. If you filled out your census last year, then you probably had a few questions about faith, and you sort of helped fill out these numbers, right? So typically what people will latch on to is that anywhere between 60 to 85% of our country is Christian, right? That sounds really good. That's like the super majority in our country. The reality is that number comes from people who hold to a Judeo-Christian ethic. Now, for those who don't understand, that is like the moral teachings of the Bible, right? Like don't murder, adultery is bad, those sorts of things. That's like Judeo-Christian ethic, things that we hold to in our country because like they come from Christian roots, Christian teaching, like the Jewish faith and the law that morphed into the rest of our Bible, right? And so people will hold to that. And to that, I would say, you would actually have a really hard time finding any of your neighbors that don't hold to at least a loose semblance of a Judeo-Christian ethic, right? There may be some gray areas around areas like, sexuality or immigration or abortion and things like that. Some big things that we would hold to, right? But for the most part, they're going to align with you pretty closely on a lot of these things, right? Like murder is bad, and we don't have to like tell people that in this country. But there are countries where that's like not the case, and there isn't a Judeo-Christian ethic in those countries, right? So that's typically where that number comes from, and it comes through questions like that. Is like, do you believe, like the Christian ethic of murder or adultery or these sorts of things? And we ask these questions, and that's where we've come up with that 60 to 85% number, right? So while that percentage holds to that, only about 20% of our population actually identifies as evangelical Christians. 20% of our country. Now, I'm not going to do the math because I got in trouble last time I did that up here. But anyways, 20% of our country would categorize themselves as evangelical Christians, right? So the number has kind of went down significantly in that. And only about 14% would fall into the category holding orthodox views of salvation, right? So evangelical is like there is a God, there is heaven and hell, and what we do with that information, the right things that we believe or the way that we live and all this stuff, it affects that, right? That's the evangelical Christian. Driving down further into the orthodox views of salvation, that is like, do they believe in Jesus and that he is the way, right? That's getting closer to what we would kind of associate with here, right? The problem is, and 14% is actually a lot when you consider a country of, what are we, like 400 million now, right? Pretty close to that, I think. That's actually a lot. That's a lot of people. 14% of that is a lot of people. The problem is that when any amount of biblical standard is applied to that number, it drops significantly, like down to like between 1 and 3%. And here's what I mean. When people are forced to answer questions that would identify them beyond this mere label of I am a Christian, or I go to this church, or I go to that church, right? When they're pressed beyond that, and I'm not talking like difficult questions like, can you recite the 10 Commandments? I'm talking questions like, do you read your Bible like once a week? Do you pray regularly? Do you think it's important to share your faith with other people, right? Really simple questions like that. When we press that definition, like press people over that definition, that number drops down to between 1 and 3% of our population would actually hold to those things. Kind of shocking, honestly. Like, I knew it wasn't as high as we thought it was, but I was sort of shocked as I did the research around this week. So needless to say, as followers of Jesus, we're not even remotely in the majority in this country. And so I think the alternative question that comes up is this. Could it be that we are engaging in a mission so similar to the world around us that it could hardly be said that we are an opposing force in danger of drawing hostility? Could it be that our mission, our attitudes, and our actions are so similar to the world around us that, like, we're not seen as aliens in a foreign land? Like, we're seen as citizens of this world, and therefore, we're not seen as an oppositional force that's, like, in any sort of risk for drawing persecution. And I think this hits a little bit closer to where we're headed this morning, right? That is to say that our attitudes, actions, and values are so indistinguishable from the world around us, like, which we've already proven is not a Christian culture, at least not in the majority, that we are not perceived as a threat to the prominent culture around us. The reality is that outside of a few isolated incidents, we're absolutely right, that there is relatively little persecution here in America. And this is exactly what makes it such a difficult topic to talk about. Not because it's an experience that we don't have, right? But because it's something that isn't happening that should be happening, right? As we're going to see through these verses, that if we live out these Beatitudes, right, like this is going to be sort of a natural consequence of these things. Could it be that we have somehow turned our faith into something that can live at peace with the kingdoms of this world around us? A kingdom that the Bible actually explicitly tells us is ran by Satan. To that we would say, absolutely not, right? Like we wouldn't do that. We wouldn't throw our hat into that. But could it be that we have aligned with a kingdom that values the elevation of self above a poorness of spirit? And it's this mindset that says that we can be the solution to all that is wrong in us and in the world around us, right? If we can just be moral enough, if we can just vote the right people into office, right? If we can just pursue the right social agenda, or we can just exterminate the evil around us, whatever that is and however you would define that, right? If we can just get rid of that out of the world, right, that we can like build a better kingdom here. And the reality is that this is in direct opposition to the poorness of spirit that recognizes that we are actually the problem. We're actually what's wrong with the world around us, and everything that's broken and messed up is a result of 7.5 billion people making choices every single day to shortcut their way towards success and significance and satisfaction, right? Could it be that we have aligned ourselves with a kingdom that calls evil good and good evil, instead of mourning the cost of our sin? To this we would say, absolutely not, man. Like, we are way, way too righteous to do that, right? Like, I'm against abortion, like, I'm against all of these things. We sort of have our token list of things that we're just like, we can sort of spout off as like an evangelical Christian. That no, we're against this. We wouldn't call these things good, right? Instead, though, I think it actually looks a little more subtle than that in the day-to-day. It looks like a fear, or it looks like silence in the face of injustice for the sake of peace, to be a peacekeeper. It looks like a fear of being labeled politically, because our culture has been so dramatically polarized that you can't step outside of your own party to speak about things that you know matter, right? Or, on the other end of that spectrum, you give your allegiance so fully to a particular political party that you will overlook major incongruities with the Bible, right? And within that party itself, and reach for peace through whatever means necessary. And I could go like on and on and on, right? That's 3 of the Beatitudes, but I think you get sort of the picture of where I was going at with this, right? It's the idea that the kingdom of this world is at odds at every turn with the kingdom that we are citizens of if we have decided to follow Jesus. And this is why it was so important that we worked our way back through, and we did the dry bit right there at the first, right? This is why it was so important for us to work our way back through those first 7 Beatitudes, because they are all contingent on one another. That if we fail to approach God in this poorness of spirit, right, and instead we opt to elevate self, right, and our desires and our like goodness, then we fail to operate in that meekness and that submission. We fail to pursue God's design for our satisfaction. We fail to give out mercy and grace because we fail to see the mercy and the grace and the forgiveness of God in its right context, right? So here it is, and this is why it's so important, because if you live out these Beatitudes, right, if you begin to inculcate these 7 attitudes in you, then the result is persecution, always, right? Jesus, he didn't want his followers to be unaware, and this is why I believe that he ended the Beatitudes with this particular beatitude, right? He didn't want his followers to be unaware of the response that these attitudes will garner from the world around us. That, man, if you operate in genuine poorness of spirit, right? Like that doesn't elevate self, but actually sees self in its right context, that's at odds with the value statements of this world, right? That says that you can just be good enough, that if you can just knuckle down and you can do enough and you can sort of like fix yourself in these areas, that like, dude, we can make a difference in the world around us, right? Like, dude, no, or the attitude that says, like, no one else gets to define what satisfaction looks like for you. That's a deeply personal thing that you get to define, and you get to decide what satisfies and brings success and significance, even if it means stepping on other people to gain those things, right? Like, that's the values of the world around us. But if we live antithetical to that, if we live in the opposite of that, in this upside-down kingdom of Jesus that has very upside-down and countercultural values, then the result of that will always be persecution. Did you notice what Jesus said? That there were those who have come before us. Like, there's a biblical precedence for this. And go read the prophets in the Old Testament. Because these guys stood up, and they were peacemakers. They were completely submitted to God. They lived in a complete poorness of spirit, right? Like, in their dress, actually, like, it reflected that. They had, like, they dressed like these wild men that lived out in the countryside and ate locusts and honey, and like the birds fed them and stuff. It's this picture of someone who lives in this countercultural kingdom of God. And what was the result for these people? That meant time and time again, the kingdoms of this world, like, they killed them. And what about Jesus? Jesus lived out these attitudes perfectly, and where did that get him? Right? On a cross. Here's what Jesus would say in John chapter 15. He says, if the world hates you, remember that it hated me first. The world would love you as one of its own if you belong to it, but you're no longer part of the world. That I chose you to come out of this world, and so it hates you. Do you remember what I told you? A slave is not greater than the master. Meaning that if they won't respect me, the master of this house, what do you think they're going to do to you? Right? He says, since they persecuted me, naturally they're going to persecute you. And if they had listened to me, they would have listened to you. But as it stands, they're going to do all of this to you because of me. For they have rejected the one who has sent me. Now, we can oftentimes think that because it's becoming harder to be a Christian in America, right? That, like, somehow the faith is in danger, right? And so what we often do is we find ourselves with a sword in our hands, much like Peter did in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? It's like all of a sudden this thing that we've been like working in, this kingdom that we have been living in and pursuing, is like it's threatened all of a sudden. And so what do? We grab the sword, we grab the thing that's natural to us, and we just start swinging wildly, right? And we're no better with a sword than Peter was, because what did he do? He swung for a head and he lopped off an ear, that he was terrible with it. And I believe there's a really good picture of this, right? It's that vengeance is mine, says the Lord. Vengeance and wrath and judgment are reserved for God and for God alone. Why? Because you can't do it. And we can't met that out. We can't, like, you and I, we don't have the capability of wielding the sword. That is reserved for God and for God only. And instead, the option we're given is self-sacrificial love and grace and mercy and forgiveness as we approach the world, right? Because God is going to come one day and he is going to judge, like what does that leave us in our approach to the world and the kingdoms around us? Well, it leaves us with this devotion to self-sacrificial love and forgiveness and grace, right? And so when we see like it becoming harder, we can think that like it's like the kingdom is under threat. The reality is that nothing could be further from the truth, right? Jesus would say that not even the gates of hell themselves can stop the forward advancement of the kingdom of God through his church. So if we aren't experiencing persecution, and like please listen to this, if we're not experiencing persecution, perhaps it is because we have forsaken the attitudes of Jesus. Notice I didn't say the Judeo-Christian ethic, right? Notice I didn't say that it's because we've forsaken the Judeo-Christian ethic. No. It's because we've forsaken the attitudes of Jesus, and those are very specific things. Things like poorness of spirit, and submission. Things like a hunger and a thirst, a pursuit of God's righteousness and His satisfaction as He's defined it. A pursuit of mercy as we approach our fellow man. A pursuit of this peacemaking mission that we have been engaged in. These are the attitudes, right? So perhaps it's because we have forsaken those attitudes for attitudes that are actually more consistent with the world around us. So this isn't to say that we go looking for persecution, right? Or that or this isn't about promoting this militaristic view of our faith where we march into the world and it's if we're not being persecuted, then we're approaching it the wrong way, right? It's not what I'm saying here, right? In fact, Jesus would say that in His very upside-down kingdom, it's those who would lay their life down and extend that mercy and grace that are seen as the heroes and the victorious people. And so, this final beatitude is meant to simply serve as this litmus test for the presence of the other beatitudes in your life, right? If these attitudes exist in you, and you are growing in the degree that these attitudes exist in you, man, this is going to be something that becomes part of your normal experience of faith. So that's the premise, right? That's it. But I said everyone comes with a promise. And I want to close today with the promise, right? Here it is. I want to read it again in case we forgot. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great. So that's the promise. Be glad because you got a reward in heaven. Super specific, right? That's really awesome. So I don't know if you guys saw, but I was on Facebook this week, and I was asking for something. Anybody remember what I was asking for? A big rope! Yeah, I didn't get the rope. Needless to say, it is not here on the stage with me. I was going to use it as a sermon illustration, and so you guys are going to have to use your imaginations because I still want to use the rope. Kind of like we did with the mirror earlier, right? You notice I'm really bad at setting up the sermon illustrations. I gotta get better at that. So I wanted a big rope, and I wanted it to be as big and bulky and long as possible, and I was going to wind it all over and make a mess over the stage, and I was actually going to run it out the back door here, and I was going to ask you guys to imagine that this rope ran out the door and down the street and actually continued on for forever, 100 billion times around the earth, or more. We don't know actually where that rope ends, and it may not even have an ending to it. And that rope, I wanted you to see that represents our life. And I was going to have some red electrical tape up here, and so here's my red electrical tape. You're going to have to totally imagine this. Thanks for playing along today. And I was going to start winding that around the rope. And so this is your life, here on earth. And you know what, man? If you don't smoke and drink to excess, you exercise regularly, you get a few more extra winds around your rope, right? You eat healthy. You're not constantly stressed out. You seek medical help when you need it. Those kind of things. You can have a pretty good size rope, right? But at some point, it gets cut off, and that rope is only so long. That little red section is only so long. Now here's the deal. Here's the problem with that sermon illustration. Is that you, as people sitting in the audience, you can see the whole rope, right? You have the wrong perspective. In order for that sermon illustration to actually work, we would need to get on the magic school bus and shrink down to the size of a dust mite, right? And we would need to go and we would need to set on the surface of that red part. Because the way our life actually works is a lot of times we are so close to it, we're so in the middle of the trees that we can't even see the forest, right? We can't see over this next ridge, which may be the marital conflict that you're currently in. The financial issues. We can't even look backwards and see a time where we weren't struggling with our kids through parenting issues or whatever, work issues. And so our perspective is incredibly limited on the surface of this rope. If we're at that microscopic perspective, right? That we can't see the end of the rope, the end of the red on this rope, and we sure can't see the rest of the rope that extends beyond the stage and out the door and down the street, right? That you actually have the wrong perspective of the rope in this moment that we need to sort of connect with our reality, right? Because this is us. This is where we live. We live at some cross-section on this rope, and it may be in the middle of some marital conflict or business issues, or it may be a good season, right? It may be an awesome time, but the thing is that even in the best seasons, we can't see the ends of the red on that rope. Now here's the deal, and this is why I wanted to do this. I believe that this verse is a perspective shift for us. It's this invitation to an expanded perspective that considers what lies beyond the present. Because we can't see the end of that red, can we? Did you notice that this was a very vague promise? when compared to the others, right? And this is absolutely unlike all of the other Beatitudes, which have some way in which they can be experienced in the here and now. And you would have to be able to read Greek to sort of like get this piece of it. But this promise actually is entirely in the future. That this isn't something that you can lay a hold of right now. This is a promise. It is some vague promise of like a future reality that lies out in front of you. And so if it isn't the actual promise itself that this is calling us to, I think what it's calling us to is this perspective shift. I think this promise is ultimately an invitation to trust God. To trust God in this reality that isn't currently like visible to us. That is to say that we would live in light of a reality that isn't presently visible. And it doesn't just go for this final beatitude either. Remember I told you that all of the other beatitudes, that yes, they are present, but they also have this future sense in them. So I want to read through a few things, right? Because it's inviting us to trust even when we can't see something. And that sounds a whole lot like faith, right? Like it's this choice that we make. I think a lot of times people, they associate faith and trust with this like feeling that we have. They're like, oh man, I feel like God is really there. And so sometimes when they don't feel God there, it's like, man, my faith is like growing cold and this. Man, faith and trust is this like cognitive decision. It is a choice that you make to hold true to a reality that isn't presently visible or that lies out in front of you. And it's just that. It's a choice, right? And you get to make a choice in this. You get to make the choice of like, do you trust God enough to come to Him in poorness of spirit? Because all you have to offer is brokenness. Or are we still sort of leaning on our own understanding and our own strength and our own power in this regard, right? Do you trust Jesus for the debt that He paid and mourn over the cost of your sin? Or are you still like seeking to do better and try harder so maybe next time you won't do that thing or like fall into that sin? Like are you still leaning in your own efforts, right? And when we do that, what's the result? It isn't comfort. It's this perpetual state of guilt and shame, right? It's this perpetual mourning. Instead of this moment in time mourning when we realize that yes, our sin absolutely was costly, but it didn't cost me, thank goodness. That Jesus came and He took that cost on my behalf. And I'm quick to seek forgiveness and restoration in that and in all my relationships. Do you trust God enough to submit to Him in meekness, even when you don't understand where He's leading or why? Right? Because it's easy to say, like, yeah, just stay in the guardrails, right? The problem is when the guardrails are really, like, the area inside the guardrails is really bumpy and part of the bridge is washed out, right? It's in those moments when satisfaction sort of escapes us and it seems like, man, if we're going to do this, we have to shortcut our way to that success and that significance and that satisfaction because the road's washed out here. Like we can't trudge through that, man. The question is, do you trust God enough in those moments to continue to pursue the thing that He has defined as good and evil and lean into His understanding? Do you trust God enough to lean on Him? Do you trust that God will come and administrate judgment and justice perfectly in the future so that you can freely extend mercy and grace and forgiveness in the present? Do you trust God that He is going to come in ultimate judgment, in perfect judgment and justice one day? So that frees you up as you approach all of your relationships to lean in and be merciful and grace-filled, right? Do you trust God that He has made every man, woman, and child in His image, and therefore that allows us to be pure in our motivations of love towards others? Do you trust that God has a plan for peace? A plan that requires us maybe to like potentially lay down our lives sacrificially for the good of others, just as Jesus did, so that we can bring about peace and be called peacemakers? Do you trust that plan for peace? Or do you regularly look down and find yourself with a sword in your hand, seeking to make peace on your own terms? And finally, do you trust that God is in control of all things? So much so that no matter how the world responds to these attitudes in you, that even if people insult you, break out your teeth, right? Persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you, that you can maintain that that eternal perspective that is constantly driving you back to all of these attitudes. Like all things, our relationship to God in this area is perpetuated on faith. It's this choice. It's a decision around all of these attitudes that you have to choose to like have these in you, right? And some of them don't make sense. In fact, in light of the culture around us, none of them make sense. They're all at odds with the culture that exists around us. And the end result, if we do have these attitudes, is going to be that you don't fit in. Right? You don't fit neatly into any political party. You don't fit neatly into any social group that isn't at its heart a community of Jesus followers. All right? And to do so is to be a peacekeeper. Like if you can find yourself in those things, and in that moment, if we've become a peacekeeper, then we've sacrificed something. We've sacrificed one of these attitudes that doesn't land us in this place. Now I know that is like a lot, and so let me make this really easy with a single question that you can take out of here. And I think like that if you take this, you can take it into your week. It's very portable, and if you go back in and read the Beatitudes this week, I think it will be very helpful. And it's this question right here. Do you have enough faith to change your attitude? Do you have enough faith to change your attitude? You know, we've entitled this series Waypoints. It's because waypoints on a map are those things that we constantly check our map. They're these like monuments or these areas that like we know what it looks like. It's this mountain, it's that tree, it's that river or whatever, right? Because the problem is as we go through life, sometimes my attitudes get off track, right? Sometimes I fail to operate in poorness of spirit, and instead I choose to elevate self. Sometimes I fail to extend mercy and grace and forgiveness. Sometimes I opt to be a peacekeeper instead of a peacemaker, and in doing so, in doing all of these, I can find myself incredibly off course from the attitudes that Jesus has called us to. But these are the waypoints that Jesus has like set up for us. And so we constantly have to kind of go back and navigate our way back to these things. And the question in that moment, when you find yourself off track, and like no one intentionally gets themselves off track, do they? Like you don't intentionally seek to get lost, right? You don't intentionally seek to go off the rails in your attitudes or your relationships towards other people. It's all really real, like natural things that lead us to that, right? And the way back to that oftentimes is incredibly countercultural. And it isn't something that may be instantly evident to us outside of going back to the Bible. And so do you choose in that moment to have enough faith in the promises, the blessed, joy-filled life that God has promised us through these Beatitudes to come back and orient your way back to these attitudes, right? And I think that's easily personally applicable to every person in this room because we all come in here off course and off track in certain ways, right? And there's enough waypoints along this sermon series that we're going to be in to like navigate our way back to. But the key in all of these from this week on out is going to be our attitude. And it changes the way that we navigate back to these things. So, again, I don't know where you came in here at, but take this question with you this week. Work it over coffee with some friends or something like that. I don't know. But I think it's a good one that we should ponder as we work our way into this week. Will you guys pray with me as we close things out? Father God, I just thank you so much. Thank you for your word. Thank you for the waypoints of these attitudes that Jesus had that we are commanded to have as well. Father, I just pray, knowing, believing wholeheartedly that you will answer yes as we ask for you to work these attitudes into our hearts, in our minds this week, Father. I just ask that we would be a people that operates in poorness of spirit, grace, and mercy, as peacemakers in our community, Father, that you would use us and you would use the outpost to those ends, Father. We just ask that you would bring us all back together next week. That you bless us and keep our family safe, good in this week. And we ask all these in Jesus' name. Amen. Awesome, guys. Y'all have a good week.